There is something deeply confusing about loving an avoidant. Because in the beginning, it rarely feels impossible. Sometimes it even feels beautiful, easy, unexpectedly close. Like maybe, after everything you have been through, you finally found someone who understands you. Someone quiet, independent, mysterious. Someone who feels safe in a way you cannot fully explain. And for a while, things feel good, maybe even deeply good, until closeness starts becoming real. And suddenly, something shifts. The text slows down. The warmth changes. The emotional closeness that once felt natural starts feeling harder to reach. You notice it immediately. The distance, the hesitation, the subtle pulling away. And because you care, you do what most loving people naturally do. You move closer. You check in more. You explain yourself more carefully. You try harder to fix whatever feels off. You become softer, more patient, more understanding. You tell yourself, they're just overwhelmed. They've been hurt before. If I love them correctly, they'll feel safe enough to stay. But strangely, the more effort you give, the colder the connection becomes. And this is the part that hurts. Because from your perspective, you are trying to save the relationship. You are trying to protect closeness. You are trying to stop the distance before it grows. But from the avoidance nervous system, something completely different is happening. What feels like love to you can start feeling like pressure to them. And that sentence alone can feel devastating to hear. Because your intention was never pressure. Your intention was care. Your intention was, please don't drift away from me. But avoidance rarely responds to love the way most people expect. Because underneath their distance, there is often something much deeper happening. A quiet fear that closeness will eventually cost them something. Their independence, their emotional control, their sense of safety, maybe even themselves. And most avoidants do not consciously think this. They feel it in their body, in the tightening of their chest, in the sudden urge to withdraw after intimacy, in the strange discomfort that appears the moment something starts feeling emotionally serious. Because for many avoidants, closeness does not only feel warm, it also feels dangerous. Not because they do not care, not because they are heartless, but because somewhere along the way, their nervous system learned something painful. Depending on people hurts. Needing people hurts. Closeness eventually overwhelms. So when someone starts loving them deeply, especially someone emotionally available, it can wake up fear they do not even fully understand themselves. And this is where the painful paradox begins. Because when an avoidant starts pulling away, most people move closer, which makes perfect sense. Distance naturally creates anxiety, especially if you are someone who loves deeply. You notice the silence, so you text. You notice the emotional flatness, so you try harder. You feel them slipping, so you fight for the connection. Because somewhere inside you, there is a hope that says, if I just love harder, maybe we can get back to how things were. But here is what nobody prepares you for. The harder you chase, the less space there is for them to actually feel your absence. And absence matters, because people rarely miss what feels permanently available. Sit with that for a moment. Not because this is about playing games, not because love should become strategy, but because human psychology works through contrast, through space, through emotional gaps. Missing someone requires room. It requires silence. It requires moments where your brain reaches for someone and realizes they are not immediately there. That is where longing begins. That is where reflection begins. That is where emotional awareness quietly grows. But when you are constantly present, constantly reassuring, constantly holding together the emotional weight of the relationship, there is no space, no contrast, no absence. only certainty. And certainty, while comforting to anxious hearts, often makes avoidance feel emotionally crowded. Not loved, crowded. Because when closeness already feels overwhelming, more closeness can accidentally feel like emotional pressure, even when it comes from genuine care. And maybe this is the uncomfortable truth no one wanted to tell you. Sometimes, the more you chase an avoidant, the easier it becomes for them to avoid feeling the emotional reality of losing you. Because deep down, they know you are still there, still waiting, still reaching, still trying to close the distance they created. And that predictability, while born from love, can quietly keep the cycle alive. You pursue, they retreat. You panic, they need space. You explain, they shut down. And somehow, both people end up exhausted. One person feeling abandoned, the other feeling overwhelmed. Neither person fully understanding what is actually happening underneath it all. Maybe pause here for a second, because if this sounds painfully familiar, I want you to ask yourself something honestly. How much of your energy lately has gone into trying to stop someone from leaving? And at what point did loving them slowly start becoming emotional survival? Because what happens next in this dynamic is where everything begins to change. Not when you chase harder, not when you finally say the perfect thing, but when something inside you becomes too tired to keep running after someone who keeps stepping away. And strangely, that is often the moment avoidants begin feeling something they could not feel before: absence. But this is where things become painful, because most people think, if I just love harder, if I explain myself better, if I stay patient, if I prove how much I care, eventually the avoidant will feel safe enough to stay. And at first, that logic makes sense, because when someone starts pulling away from you, your instinct is to move closer, not farther. You text more. You become softer, more understanding, more patient. You explain your intentions. You reassure them. You try to remove every reason they could possibly have for leaving. Because in your mind, love means showing up. Love means trying. Love means not giving up on someone. So you tell yourself, they're just scared. They just need consistency. They just need more love. And maybe part of that is true. But here is the part almost nobody tells you. The more you chase an avoidant, the harder it becomes for them to actually feel you. Not because they are cruel, not because they do not care, and not because your love means nothing, but because something deeper starts happening inside their nervous system. See, missing someone requires something most people are terrified of: space, a real emotional gap. Because nobody misses what never leaves. Nobody longs for something that is constantly available. Think about that. Missing someone means reaching for something familiar and suddenly realizing it is not there. It means waking up in the middle of the night and feeling the silence where someone's presence used to be. It means noticing the absence, feeling it, sitting with it. But if you are always there, always texting first, always reopening conversations, always checking in after they disappear, always reassuring them after they pull away, there is never actually room for absence to exist. And without absence, there is nothing for them to feel, nothing to miss, nothing to emotionally process. Because even while they withdraw, the connection keeps getting carried by you, quietly, constantly. You become the emotional bridge holding everything together. And eventually, without realizing it, you become something dangerous to the dynamic. Predictable, not in a bad way. Predictable in the sense that no matter how distant they become, some part of them starts assuming you'll still be there, even after the coldness, even after the silence, even after the confusion. And this is where people misunderstand avoidance completely. Because most assume if they are pulling away, It means they don't care. But avoidance rarely works like that. What often happens is far more complicated. They care, sometimes deeply, painfully deeply, but closeness activates fear at the exact same time. And that contradiction, it creates chaos inside them. Because love does not always feel like comfort to an avoidant. Sometimes, love feels like pressure, not because you are pressuring them intentionally, but because closeness wakes something up. Expectation, dependence, vulnerability, the possibility of disappointing someone, the possibility of losing themselves, the possibility of needing someone too much. And for someone whose nervous system learned early that closeness could become overwhelming, these feelings can feel terrifying, even when the relationship itself is good, even when they genuinely care about you. So what do? They create space, distance, withdrawal, not necessarily because they want to lose you, but because somewhere inside them, distance feels regulating, like emotional oxygen. And this is where chasing starts hurting both people. Because the more anxious one person becomes, the more overwhelmed the avoidant feels. And the more overwhelmed the avoidant feels, the more distance they create, which then makes the anxious person panic harder. And suddenly, without either person realizing it, love becomes survival. One person reaching, the other retreating, over and over and over again, until nobody feels safe anymore. Maybe pause here for a second, because if you have lived this dynamic, you probably know exactly how exhausting it feels. The waiting, the overthinking, the constant wondering. Did I say too much? Did I scare them away? Should I text again? Should I give space? Do they even care? And somewhere in the middle of all that confusion, you slowly start abandoning yourself. Not all at once, just little by little. You stop focusing on your own peace, your own needs, your own emotional stability, because all your energy starts orbiting around someone else's distance. And maybe nobody has said this to you clearly enough yet. Love should not require you to disappear to keep someone comfortable. Yes, healthy relationships require patience, understanding, compassion, but compassion cannot only move in one direction, because eventually, being the only one holding the connection together becomes exhausting. And this is where something important shifts. The moment you stop chasing, not as punishment, not to manipulate, not to teach them a lesson, that energy never works. People can feel it. No, the shift happens when you stop because you are finally tired of abandoning yourself. That kind of stopping feels different, quieter, stronger. You stop texting just to calm your anxiety. You stop forcing conversations that feel one-sided. You stop trying to rescue closeness every time distance appears. And instead, you do something unfamiliar. You let the silence exist. At first, it feels unbearable, because silence feels like loss, especially if you lean anxious. Every quiet moment feels loaded. You want to reach out, fix it, close the gap, restore the connection. But if you can tolerate the discomfort, something unexpected begins happening, not only inside them, inside you. Because for the first time, your nervous system starts learning. I can survive uncertainty. I do not have to chase to feel safe. I do not have to abandon myself to keep love alive. And that changes everything. Because now your energy shifts. You stop showing up desperate, fearful, overextended, and start showing up calmer, more grounded, more whole. Ironically, that version of you is the version avoidance usually feels safest around. Not because you stopped caring, but because your care no longer feels heavy. It no longer feels panicked. It no longer feels like emotional urgency. And once the pressure disappears, something subtle begins to happen inside many avoidants. The emotional noise quiets. Their nervous system settles, and suddenly, they can finally hear something they could not hear before. The silence, your absence, the missing, because now, for the first time, they actually have space to feel what your presence meant. And that is the paradox almost nobody understands. Sometimes, the thing that finally allows someone to feel you is no longer chasing them to feel you back. But there is another piece to this that changes everything. Because stopping the chase is not enough by itself. If underneath the silence, you are still emotionally waiting, still checking their profile, still hoping every notification is them, still building your entire emotional world around whether they come back, then the old dynamic is still quietly running, just in silence. And that is where everything either changes or repeats, because eventually, you reach a moment where the real question is no longer, how do I make them miss me? The real question becomes, what part of me keeps abandoning myself for someone emotionally unavailable? And that question changes the entire story. Because once you arrive at that question, something uncomfortable begins happening. The focus starts shifting, slowly, quietly, almost against your will, away from them and back toward yourself. And if you are being honest, that is usually the part nobody wants, because it feels easier to keep decoding the avoidant, easier to analyze their mixed signals, their silence, their inconsistency, the hot and cold, the moments they felt close, followed by the moments they disappeared. Because as long as the focus stays on them, there is still hope that one perfect sentence, one perfect conversation, one final act of patience might finally make everything click, might finally make them stay, might finally make them understand how deeply you cared. But eventually, something inside you grows tired. Not tired of loving, tired of surviving love. And there is a difference, because surviving love feels like constantly bracing yourself, waiting for the emotional weather to change, wondering who you are going to get today, the warm version, the distant version, the emotionally available version, or the version who suddenly feels unreachable. And if you have spent long enough in this cycle, you probably know what happens next. You begin shrinking yourself. You stop saying certain things. Stop asking for reassurance. Stop bringing up needs. Stop mentioning the moments that hurt. Because every hard conversation starts feeling risky. Like if you ask for too much, they might disappear again. So you become easier, quieter, less emotional, less expressive, more understanding, more patient, more careful, until one day, you barely recognize yourself anymore. And this is where something heartbreaking happens in avoidant dynamics. The person who loves the hardest often becomes the person carrying the most loneliness. Because imagine loving someone deeply while constantly editing yourself to avoid losing them. Imagine needing closeness while pretending you are okay with distance. Imagine teaching yourself not to need too much, just to avoid feeling abandoned again. That kind of loneliness is difficult to explain, because technically, someone is there, but emotionally, you still feel alone. Maybe pause here for a moment, because if this feels familiar, I wonder how long you have been carrying relationships by yourself. How many times you convinced yourself they just need time. They're scared. They care deep down. And maybe they do. Maybe they really do. But there is another truth that deserves space here too. Someone caring about you, and someone being emotionally capable of loving you consistently, are not always the same thing. That truth hurts, because love would feel simpler if caring alone fixed everything. But relationships are not built only on feelings. They are built on capacity, consistency, emotional safety, the ability to stay present when things become uncomfortable. And this is where the dynamic quietly changes. Because once you stop chasing, once you stop making their emotional comfort your full-time responsibility, something new becomes possible. You begin noticing the difference between love and emotional labor. Because many people in anxious-avoidant dynamics are not just loving. They are carrying, managing, compensating, holding emotional weight for two people, explaining misunderstandings, repairing every rupture, reaching out after silence, keeping connection alive through sheer emotional effort. And at first, it feels noble. It feels like devotion, like loyalty, like unconditional love. Until one day, you realize you are exhausted, not because you loved too much, but because you were loving without being met. And something shifts when that realization lands. You stop asking, how do I finally get them to choose me? And begin asking, what would it look like if I chose myself to? That question feels different, softer, but stronger, because choosing yourself does not mean becoming cold, detached, or suddenly pretending you never cared. No, choosing yourself sounds more like this. I can love you without abandoning myself. I can understand your wounds without carrying responsibility for healing them. I can care deeply and still acknowledge when something hurts me. That kind of love feels unfamiliar at first, especially if you are used to earning closeness, fighting for connection, overgiving, over-explaining, over-functioning. Because now, instead of chasing reassurance, you begin becoming reassurance for yourself. And this changes your entire energy, not performatively, not in a way designed to make them jealous. That energy always feels forced. No, something quieter happens. You become steadier. You stop spiraling every time they go quiet. You stop making someone else's inconsistency the center of your emotional world. You begin building a life again, returning to things that once made you feel alive. Friends, goals, dreams, rest, peace, the parts of yourself that got lost while waiting for emotional certainty. And something fascinating begins happening when this shift becomes real. Avoidance often feels safer around people who feel emotionally grounded. Because grounded people do not chase. They do not collapse emotionally every time distance happens. They do not create pressure every time uncertainty appears. They feel breathable, steady, emotionally spacious. And this is the paradox that confuses so many people. The more desperately you try to hold on, the harder it becomes for closeness to exist. But when you stop gripping so tightly, not from resentment, but from self-respect, the entire emotional atmosphere changes. Because now, your presence feels different. Less fear, less urgency, less emotional pressure, more calm, more steadiness, more space. And space, when it feels emotionally safe, is often what allows avoidance to finally exhale. But there is something important you need to hear. Even if they come closer after this shift, even if they start missing you, even if they suddenly become warmer, that still cannot be the end of the story. Because this is not just about whether they return. It is about whether the pattern changes, whether closeness becomes healthier, whether emotional responsibility becomes shared, whether both people are finally willing to grow. Because love alone does not heal dynamics. Awareness does. Safety does. Effort does. Healing does. And if you skip that truth, you risk repeating the same story with a different beginning. Because sometimes people return without actually changing. And that creates a new kind of heartbreak. The heartbreak of hope without transformation. So before you ask, will they miss me? There is a deeper question worth sitting with. If they came back tomorrow, would the relationship finally feel safe? Or would you just be returning to the same cycle, hoping for a different ending? Because sometimes, The biggest transformation in these connections is not the avoidant finally realizing your worth. Sometimes, it is you finally realizing you should never have had to prove it in the first place. And once that realization lands, something powerful begins waking up inside you. Not bitterness, not resentment, something quieter than that, something stronger, self-respect. And when self-respect enters the room, love starts looking very different. Because now, you stop asking someone to choose you and start asking whether the connection is actually choosing peace too. And that changes everything. And maybe that is the part nobody talks about enough. Because somewhere along the way, this stops becoming only about the avoidant. It stops becoming only about why they pulled away, why they went cold, why they disappeared right when things started feeling real. And quietly, without you even noticing at first, the question changes from, how do I make them stay? To, why did I keep staying in something that kept hurting me? And that question is not blame. It is not criticism. It is not, you should have known better. No, it is something much gentler than that. It is curiosity, honest curiosity, because most people who love avoidance are not weak. They are not naive. They are not too emotional. Usually, they are people with enormous hearts, people who know how to understand, how to forgive, how to stay, people who love deeply enough to see pain underneath difficult behavior. And that is beautiful, truly. But sometimes, the people who understand everyone else the most quietly abandon themselves in the process. They become so focused on understanding another person's wounds that they stop protecting their own. And maybe this is where something important needs to be said. Understanding someone does not mean endlessly enduring pain from them. Compassion matters. Patience matters. Trauma matters. Attachment wounds matter. But so do you. Your nervous system matters. Your peace matters. Your emotional safety matters. Because love was never meant to feel like emotional survival. It was never meant to feel like constantly monitoring someone else's moods, waiting for warmth, managing distance, interpreting silence, overthinking every shift in energy. Real love, healthy love, should feel safe enough to rest inside. Not perfect, not effortless, but safe. And if you have spent months, maybe years, trying to prove your worth to someone who could only meet you halfway, I want you to hear this carefully. You were never hard to love. You were never too much. You were trying to build closeness with someone whose relationship to closeness felt complicated. That matters, because sometimes the pain of loving an avoidant becomes deeply personal. You start thinking, maybe I asked for too much. Maybe if I were calmer, more patient, less emotional, more understanding, they would have stayed. But healing begins the moment you stop turning someone else's limitations into evidence that you were unworthy. Read that again, because it changes everything. Someone struggling to receive love does not mean you were unlovable. Someone pulling away does not erase what you brought into the connection. Your care mattered. Your effort mattered. Your love mattered, even if they could not fully hold it. And maybe that is the hardest grief of all, realizing someone cared about you, but still could not meet you where you needed them to. That grief deserves compassion, because loving someone who pulls away often leaves invisible bruises, the kind nobody sees, the exhaustion, the self-doubt, the constant emotional waiting, the loneliness of loving someone who sometimes felt close and sometimes felt miles away. But there comes a moment, quietly, where you stop asking, will they finally choose me? And start asking, what would it look like if I finally chose myself? Not in anger, not from resentment, but from love, real love, the kind that says, I will stop abandoning myself to keep someone else comfortable. I will stop shrinking my needs just to preserve connection. I will stop confusing emotional inconsistency with chemistry. Because chemistry alone cannot sustain love. Love also needs safety, presence, consistency, effort, mutuality. And yes, sometimes avoidance heal. Sometimes they grow. Sometimes they become deeply loving, emotionally safe partners, especially when they become aware of their patterns and choose healing for themselves. That possibility is real. But here is what matters most. You cannot heal someone by abandoning yourself. You cannot love someone into emotional readiness. And you should never have to disappear just to be chosen. Maybe pause here for a second, because if this story felt personal, I want you to ask yourself something honestly. Have you been trying to save a connection while quietly losing yourself inside it? And if the answer is yes, then maybe this moment is not the ending you feared. Maybe it is the beginning of something softer, stronger, healthier, a return to yourself. Because the truth is, the moment you stop chasing is not only the moment an avoidant might finally feel your absence. Sometimes, it is the moment you finally stop abandoning your own presence too. And that changes everything. If this resonated with you, tell me honestly in the comments. What is one thing you are finally choosing for yourself instead of chasing? Sometimes healing begins the moment we say it out loud. And if this conversation helped you feel a little less alone in what you have been carrying, stay close to this space. We are building something here for people learning how to stop abandoning themselves in the name of love. Because understanding yourself might just become the relationship that changes every other one.